is Don Covay, and you listen to SoulPatrol.net radio. Hello.
I want to welcome everybody to the 2003 Soul Patrol East Coast Convention. I'm Bob Davis, and I want to introduce you all to our first presenter. He comes all the way from Baltimore, Maryland, and he's going to drop some serious knowledge on us with respect to something that we all know about, but at the same time we don't talk about enough, and that's blues music and the past, present, and future of the blues. And so I'm going to turn it over to Bradley, and he's going to educate us. Feel free to ask any questions as we go through. Bradley means for this to be an interactive presentation, and I turn it over to you, Bradley. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I want to welcome everyone to the second annual Soul Patrol Convention, and I'm very grateful to have been asked to talk about blues music, something that we try to every once in a while visit on the Soul Patrol list, and I'm always amazed at the knowledge that comes back from other Soul Patrollers about the blues and their interest in the blues. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to just kind of have some fun, like Bob said, and kind of talk about the blues and where the blues came from and how it landed here. And we're going to try to take the blues up this year to pre-World War II. So we're going to go a little bit from Africa to pre-World War II Mississippi. And then maybe next year, if we're invited back, we can go to post-war and maybe bring it up a little bit closer here. What is the blues, first of all? Blues means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But blues at its essence is roots music. That's a term that's been flung around a lot commercially, roots music. Many musical genres claim blues as their roots. Rock claims blues as its roots. Jazz claims blues as its roots. And R&B claims blues at its roots. To me, blues is a chronicle of the human experience. Blues at its essence is triumph over adversity. Triumph over adversity. Blues has been around for as long as people has been around. I can hear blues in some Bach. I can definitely hear blues in some Beethoven. I can hear blues in Dvorak. But we owe a great deal to African Americans for delivering blues to the world in the form that we have it now. America's gift to the world is its music, and that music is through its black population. If you think about it, everything that America has come from other places. You know, a lot of heavy European influence here, and what we project, Asian influence, and of course a lot of Native American influence. But the only indigenous art form that America has is its music, and that music comes from black folk. All the great music that we discuss on Soul Patrol, and that we hear on Soul Patrol, and that we're going to be talking about at other panels that follow me, especially the panel on the Black Rock Coalition, can be traced directly to blues. It's the foundation. An anthropologist once observed that every developed culture has three types of music. They have a sacred music, they have a classical music, and they have a folk music. And in America, all those musics are directly tied to black folks. The sacred music in this country is spirituals and gospel. The classical music in this country is jazz. And the folk music is the blues. Every culture has three types of music, and in this country, all those musics comes from African Americans. So let's talk about that African American connection and the music of America. Blues is African American music, and its origins were brought here from Africa via the slave trade. The African roots of blues is undeniable, especially if you go back to West Africa and the griots of West Africa. A lot of things came here from Africa. A lot of what we take for granted here as being American came from Africa. But the slave trade was the way that a lot of those things came here. Early in the slave trade, the Europeans took slaves primarily from a part of Africa called what was called Senegambia. And tribes that came from that part of Africa was the Mandingos, the Hausas, the Barbaras, and one particular tribe called the Wolofs, W-O-L-O-F. And the Wolofs was to play a dominant part in the early part of the slave trade. And their Africans that came from that part of Africa came from a part of Africa that was not very heavily forested. There wasn't a lot of woods there. These are Africans that came from south of the Sahara. They interacted a lot with the Arabs. The Arabs was coming through. A lot of conquest was going on. In fact, that was one of the reasons why the indigenous African empires was disintegrating, was because of these fights that was going on. But just to concentrate on the music part, because it wasn't heavily wooded, it wasn't a big drum infusion in the music like you had down around the Congo and Angola. So they had primarily, their music was primarily stringed instruments. And to this day, John, I'm about to cue up the first one, Ali Fafi Tori. To this day, you can hear the music that was played then in what was called Senegambia, and a lot of the music that came over here with the Africans then. So we're going to hear a little bit from a contemporary named Ali Fafi Tori, who's from Mali, who's actually performing now. You can hear a little bit of the music that was being played then and the kind of music that came here. Hear the strings. Okay, that's Ali Fafi Tori, who's been called the African John Lee Hooker. The descendants of that Wolof tribe, W-O-L-O-F. Africans came from all over during the slave trade, but around the early 1700s, there were some Africans that was favored by certain planters. In Carolina and Virginia, the planters there definitely favored the Wolofs because they were considered more civilized. Some of them were actually city dwellers. There are some records of some African slaves, trusted African slaves, actually keeping some of the records for the plantation in Arabic. And they were also used as interpreters. The Wolof language was used by a lot of the African slaves, probably because a lot of the African tribes were vassals to the Wolof empires. So these were the first griots. These were the first musician class that actually came over here. And of course, as I said before, their instruments was mostly string instruments because there wasn't a lot of forests from where they came from, as opposed to the Congo and Angola, where it was mostly a drum culture. The Wolof language gave us a lot of terms that we use today that kind of speaks to our food, like banana and yams are actually Wolof terms. And some of the terms that was used by African Americans even to this day. like dega, D-E-G-A, dega, means to understand, and that word can be used as dig this, dig that. Can you dig it? That's a Waloop term from the word dega. Jeev, J-E-V, means to talk disparagingly about somebody, and that word Jeev, J-E-V, came to be used as jive. Jiving somebody is a Waloop term. Hippie, H-I-P-I, means to open up somebody's eyes. That word came to be used as hip. To hip somebody is a Waloop term. And a hip cat is a hippie cat. It's the one who opens the eyes of somebody. But one of the most important terms in terms of for this discussion is bania, M-B-A-N-I-A, which is the banjo that the Waloop brought over. So that, I hope, establishes somewhat the connection between West Africa and the musical tradition of the griots that came from Senegambia and the first slaves, and that came over here. Other things that came over from Africa is musically is a whooping, is a kind of yodeling that's a tradition amongst the Pygmies and their neighbors in the Congo, Angola region, and can be heard in the early Field Hollers and work songs. John, can you cue up Tommy Johnson, #1? This is Tommy Johnson, who recorded in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and this will give you an example of the whooping, kind of a yodeling that came over from Africa. Tommy Johnson had a big hit called Can Heat Blues that the rock group Can Heat took their name from in the 60s. But this is an example of Tommy Johnson recording in the Mississippi Delta in the late 1920s. You can hear the whooping. I thought it gave me gasoline. Okay, and if you can go to the next one on that cut, number 5. This is Can Heat Blues. I can't just a little bit. One of the things about early blues is that it was really, as opposed to other American music, that it was really a personalized kind of music. As the griots over in West Africa did, early bluesmen sing about what was going on around them. And this particular song, Can Heat Blues, Tommy Johnson was a hopeless alcoholic. And he lived in Mississippi in dry counties. And so in order to get alcohol, he would take sterno, put it in a sock, and to get the alcohol out of. And it was called Can Heat. Sterno was called Can Heat then, and this is the song he's talking about his addiction to sterno. It's called Can Heat Blues that the rock group Can Heat took. He wakes up in the morning and Can Heat is on his mind. That's what you call the blues. Been black in 1920 Mississippi and alcoholic and no alcohol around. Field Hollers. As we bring it up, as we bring the progression of music up, we get into Field Hollers. Mississippi was almost entirely an agrarian society. Slavery had been banned, had ended maybe in the last 40, 50 years, but you had the sharecropper system going on. And essentially what that was, as you know, you had these large tracts of land that was owned by a few white landowners, and they couldn't farm this land. So they set up a system called sharecropping, which some folks thought was almost as bad as slavery, where folks would come and farm the land in exchange for rent on the land and for food on the land. They supposedly got paid, but at the end of the year, they always wound up owing the company store, and B.B. King wrote a lot of nice songs about that. But as they worked in the fields, African Americans took their music with them, and they sang about things that was going on around them in the fields, and actually used the cadence of their music to kind of make the work just a little bit more bearable. There was a anthropologist from Harvard University named Charles Peabody, who in 1901 came down to Coahoma County, Mississippi, to begin a excavation of some Indian mounds. He was looking at these ancient Indian mounds to see if he can find some semblance of their civilization so he could see how they lived. So he arrived in Coahoma County, Mississippi, 1901, rented him some horses, rented him some wagons, and rented him a team of black workers and took them out to start digging it into these mounds. And immediately he noticed that as the blacks was riding to the mounds, they would start singing. They would start singing in cadence. They would start singing about riding to the mounds. They would start singing about riding in the back of this wagon. When they got to the mound, they would start singing about digging this mound. When it was down in the mound, they were singing about that. While all this work was going on, Charles Peabody, this white anthropologist from Harvard, started throwing a knife into one of the mounds while they was working, and then he realized that he was in their songs now. They were actually singing about him. They were singing about, we're down here breaking our backs, and he's up there throwing tiddlywinks. But this was all in rhyme form. And so he kind of wrote down what they were saying, wrote down some of the music. And in 1903, he published this in the Journal of American Folklore. And that's the first mention that we have of black music in the Mississippi Delta, written down, was in this magazine in 1903. So we're going to hear a little bit of an example of a field holler. And I was able to get an example of this from the song is called Bertha Bertha, and it's from the August Wilson play called Piano Lesson. And I got this off of a CD of Branford Marsalis that he did on blues. And it's from the August Wilson play, and the original cast is actually on this particular piece. I'm trying to think of his name, Rock. He played Rock on the TV show. Charles Dutton, who's from Baltimore. I don't know why I forgot that. But anyway, this is an example of a field holler, and you can imagine these folks working on a railroad or working in the cotton fields, and this is kind of how late 1800s, early turn of the century, 1900s, you would hear out in the field down in Mississippi. This is a close precursor of the blues in the 60s.
Wait on me, go ahead and marry, don't you? Wait on me, well now, might not, won't you, when I go free, might not, won't you, when I go free, well now. Come on, Dukka. Dukka know this one. Don't know this one. Oh, Lord, girl, oh, Lord, bird, oh, Lord, girl, raise them up higher, let them up on down.
excellent example, I think, of a field holler there. So we've come from Africa, we've come out of West Africa, we've come across the waters, come through the slavery system. We're now around the turn of the century. And black music up to this point is primarily minstrel, in the forms of minstrel music, medicine show music, and of course spirituals, and your field hollers and your work songs. Robert Palmer, who died a couple years ago, who came out of Arkansas and became the head pop critic for the New York Times and is an authority on pre-war Mississippi blues, described blues as this: a turn-of-the-century innovation accommodating the vocal tradition of work songs and field hollers to the expressive capabilities of the newly popular string instrument called the guitar. So you have this confluence of a vocal tradition that comes together and meets the guitar. And you have then the foundation for Mississippi Delta blues. Some of our first references about this new form of music actually comes from two people, Ma Rainey and W.C. Handy. Ma Rainey was with a group called the Rabbit Foot Minstrels, and she was in Missouri in 1902, and she heard a girl outside her tent singing this music where she would sing two lines that repeated each other and then a third line. And she thought it sounded weird, she thought it sounded repetitious, but she kind of liked it. And so she started to include it in her minstrel shows. And down south with black audiences, it became an instant hit because this was their music, this was what they was listening to, this is what they were singing. That next year, W.C. Handy, who was a African-American Memphis resident, who was also a music publisher and a band leader, a brass band leader, was at a train station in Tutwiler, Mississippi, and he heard this young black rider playing the guitar using a knife as a slide, and singing about the trains, but in the same kind of cadence where it was two lines that repeated each other, and then the third line to kind of finish it off. And he was fascinated by this music, and he asked the guy what was he playing, and he just looked at him kind of crazy and said that this was the blues. And so he went back to Memphis and actually wrote a song called, and published a song called the St. Louis Blues, which is the first published song that actually has blues in the title. Now, St. Louis Blues to our ears doesn't sound like a blues song, and that might be because it doesn't have that 12-bar cadence that we associated with the blues, and also because W.C. Handy was a band leader of a brass ensemble. It sounds more like jazz than blues, but that was the first published song that had blues in the title. So those are some of the early references to the blues. So at this point, just to see where we are now, Delta blues is here, and its antecedents are work songs, field hollers, gospel, minstrel music, medicine music, vaudeville music, jug bands, and also some influences, especially to the guitar, of white Appalachian folk and country music. As hard as plantation life in the beginning of the 1900s, as hard as the plantation work was, the sharecropping, there was always time for entertainment. And musicians were in demand, as they are now. They were in demand, and they were able to go from plantation to plantation, and guitars became their instrument of choice because it was inexpensive, didn't cost as much as a fiddle, was easy to maintain than a banjo, and it was very portable. A musician could just put it on his shoulder and go from plantation to plantation to plantation. And these were some of the first traveling folks who actually popularized this music, took it from place to place and actually traded off ideas. Just to digress for a second, the first blues record was Crazy Blues. The first published musical piece was St. Louis Blues, but the first blues record on vinyl was Crazy Blues in 1920 by Bessie Smith. So we get into now the World War I, right after World War I, and you have a lot of your people who actually founded this music. Charlie Patton is operating then, Son House, Willie Brown, Tommy Johnson, who you heard earlier, Isman Bracey, Robert Johnson, Skip James, Bukka White, Mississippi John Hurt. John, do we have the video queued up? We're going to see a little bit of Son House. This is like a rare, very rare video of Son House, who was a contemporary of Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton is considered the father of Mississippi Delta blues. He recorded around 1926, 1927. He was like the big guy. You know, he was the one that all the plantations, black, white, everybody wanted him to come and play for them. Everyone went to him to learn their stuff. But one guy who stood at the same level as Charlie Patton was Son House, who was born in the late 1800s, and he was just fantastic. And this was, I think he was like in his like 70s when this was recorded, like in the 60s. The Seattle Folk Society was This is Taj Mahal, who's going to be at the Poconos Blues Festival in a couple of weeks, who's going to introduce him.
Hi, I'm Taj Mahal, and welcome to the Masters of Country Blues Guitar. In this show, we have performances by two American musical giants, Son House and Bukka White. Both were passionate purveyors of their native Mississippi Delta music and of slide guitar. Both were seminal figures not only through their association with legendary blues pioneer Charlie Patton, but also in the strong influence Mississippi blues had on this century's music, from Robert Johnson to Muddy Waters, all the way to Eric Clapton. Son House was born in Lyons, Mississippi in 1902 and raised in this blues-rich environment as a young man. He was deeply influenced by the Baptist Church and thought about a career as a preacher. But in his own words, the women and whiskey would not let him pray. House at first scorned the blues, but in 1926, a chance encounter with a bluesman named James McCoy impressed him enough to embark on a career as a blues musician. Son has always been reckoned one of the greatest of all Delta bluesmen.
You got a letter this morning, iron is red. You say, hurry, hurry, big gal, you love it, baby. Got a letter this morning, yeah, iron is red. I grabbed up a suitcase and I took out down the road. I said, when I got there, she's laying on a cooling board. Lord, I walked up close. I looked down on the place. It's a good old guy, got the red hair and judgment day. I walked up close, I looked down in her face. I said, you girl, got a lady just there. Lord, I pulled up my arm.
Okay, that was Son House.
This is Don Covay, and you listen to SoulPatrol.net radio. Hello.
Video clip of, actually they were called back then kaleidoscopes when that was made. And we don't have a visual record of Charlie Patton. So the oldest artist from that period is Son House, and we was very, very lucky to get him. So like I said, he was from that first generation of Mississippi folk, and they spawned, of course, the second generation of Mississippi bluesmen, names that you may recognize a little bit more readily. Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, Elmore James, Howlin' Wolf, Eddie Taylor, Johnny Shines, Mississippi Fred McDowell are second generation bluesmen that came from this very tradition, that learned from Son House, that learned from Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton used to visit, lived on the same plantation as Howlin' Wolf did, and Charlie Patton had sang in a kind of a gruff kind of voice that Muddy Waters, that Howlin' Wolf took and actually helped contribute to his nickname of Howlin' Wolf. Right after the Depression, when the government was trying to get people back to work by sending out the civilian corps to build things, in their enlightenment, the Library of Congress contracted with an early ethnomusicologist named Alan Lomax to go out into the Deep South and to record a lot of the music that was going on then. And he was in Mississippi in the early 1940s, and he was able to record a really early Muddy Waters when Muddy was still living on the plantation. And when the presentation is over, I have some artifacts here from some of the things that's going on. This is this is how cotton looks when it comes out of the ground for all of you Yankees. This was actually taken off. This was taken off of the plantation that Muddy Waters was living on. It's called Stovall Plantation, and this is cotton from his plantation that I picked when I was down there picking some cotton, y'all. I was picking some cotton down on Stovall Plantation. I brought some back with me. This is cotton from the plantation that Muddy Waters came from. But we're going to hear a little bit of Alan Lomax when he went down to record Muddy Waters on this very plantation. I think it was in 1943. So this is called I Can't Be Satisfied. This is just Muddy on the guitar. You'll see a lot of similarities to what you just heard from Son House, which was a couple decades before when he first learned that song, although that recording was done much later. So this is Muddy Waters, I Can't Be Satisfied.
Back no more. Going back down south, child, don't you go. Woman, I'm trouble. I be all good now. Well, babe, I just can't be satisfied, and I just can't pay for. Well, I feel like.
Okay, now we're going to go from that to doing the same recording session, and I wanted to bring this in because he's doing a song called Rolling and Tumbling. And I wanted to play this because right after this, Muddy had to leave Mississippi in the middle of the night. Muddy on the plantation, as a lot of folks did back then, lived in these cabins, and they turned the cabins into juke joints on the weekends, and sometimes they sold moonshine. And Muddy had a little juke joint, little general store, and he got into some business difficulties with some of the white landowners about a bill, and his grandmother told him, it's best for you to leave the South. And he left the South, and he went up to Chicago where his sister and her husband was living. And Chicago, if you go to Chicago, and we have folks on Soul Patrol from Chicago, and invariably all their folks came out of Mississippi. You know, Chicago and Mississippi is such a connection there. So Mississippi's music went right up Route 61 to Chicago, and that's where Muddy Waters went, and they had heard about him. And so he immediately got work. This was right before World War II, right around World War II. And he got working in the defense industry, but he also took his guitar and played at night. And one of the songs that he played down south that he played up in Chicago was Rolling and Tumbling. I want you to hear this, and then we're going to hear the same song after Muddy realized that up here in the urban areas, up here in the Negro ghettos of Chicago, it's a lot noisier. And his little acoustic guitar is not going to be heard. So he was one of the first to actually plug in the guitar into an amp, which actually became one of the foundations of rock and roll. But this is Muddy doing Rolling and Tumbling acoustically, and then we're going to hear him doing it after he went to Chicago and had to plug in and became electrified. But this is the acoustic part, Rolling and Tumbling.
Well, I roll and I tumble, cried the whole night long. Well, I roll and I tumble, cried the whole night long. Well, I woke up this morning, didn't know right from wrong.
Alright, so that's Rolling and Tumbling down in Mississippi. Now we're going to hear the same song with Little Walter on harp, Jimmy Rogers on second guitar, Big Leroy on drums. This is a metaphor of black folks leaving the South, going to the North, and being cityfied. This is the same song a couple years later. Let's hear it. Okay, so we've come from Africa to south side of Chicago. It's right around World War II. Chess Records is the premier blues label during this time. And of course, Muddy is their premier artist. At the same time, there's some other musical trends that's going on that I need to mention. Jump blues is also happening, and the big star of jump blues is Louis Jordan. And jump blues is a marriage between jazz and blues. Remember, it's World War II. The big bands can no longer tour like they want to, so they strip the bands down to 5 or 6 pieces. And the folks who was blues inclined invented what they called jump blues at the time. Over on the strictly blues side, Chess Records signed 2 young folks named Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, who was listening to some other things that's going on. And they started out as blues musicians, but they kind of changed the beat a little bit, and truly lays the foundation for rock and roll at that time. Down south, one of the biggest names down south is a young man named Ike Turner. And Ike Turner is operating out of Clarksdale, Mississippi, where he's from, but he's also the A&R man for a lot of the record labels, and he goes around and discovers all these young folks that's going on. He also has a contract with Sun Records, and actually found Howlin' Wolf for Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records. And Sun Records started out primarily during this time as a blues label, but then Sam gets this idea that if he can find a white guy that can sound black, he can make himself a lot of money. A young man named Elvis Presley come into his recording studio off of Beale Street to do a Vanity Records, and he listens to him, and the rest is history, and that's how that took off. That part of his business became so big, he stopped recording black music and just concentrated on what came to be called rockabilly music, with artists like Johnny Cash, and I can't think of the other two, Carl Perkins, and so all this is going on. Ike Turner makes a record called Rocket 88 in 1952, which becomes #1 and is generally agreed to be considered the first rock and roll record. Before that, Ike Turner performed with a group called the Kings of Rhythm out of Clarksdale, Mississippi. Of course, this is before he met this young lady named Tina. Years before he met this young lady named Tina, but he had a blues band prior to that. So blues is coalescing and it's changing as blues actually does, and because it's Jimi Hendrix. That's the blues. This is all from Jimi Hendrix live at Woodstock, and recently on Soul Patrol we had a thread going on our favorite live recordings, and someone actually posted about that as their favorite live recording. I forgot all about it, forgot that I had it, but I'm glad I saw it so I could bring it here and share it with you. I also want to share some artifacts that's up here that I've picked up in my travels. We didn't talk a lot about Robert Johnson, who is one of the most seminal figures, one of the well-known figures in the blues. A lot of his music was covered by the Rolling Stones, Cream. Eric Clapton still does a lot of Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson, we don't really know where he's buried at. He's buried in one of two places, and I went to Mount Zion Baptist Church, where he's supposed to be buried, one of the places, and this is something that fell off the tree. That's from the graveyard from there. We talked about cotton from the plantation in Mississippi, where Muddy Waters came from, is here. This is from the Dockery Gin, from Dockery Farms in Dockery, Mississippi. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Mississippi, but when you gin the cotton, it has to be labeled. And this is an authentic Delta Cotton, Mississippi label for that. This is from Robinson, Mississippi, from the plantation there. This is some cotton from the plantation Robert Johnson was born. This is from the house, W.C. Handy's house, down in Memphis. They were moving the house when I was in Memphis a couple years ago to the foot of Beale Street in a park that they named the W.C. Handy Park, and I was able to get a piece of wood that fell off the house, and so this is here. This is something I was sharing with Don earlier. This is from the Riverside Hotel in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is famous because Bessie Smith, I think it was in 1939, was traveling through Mississippi, and she got into a really bad car accident, and she was bleeding to death on Route 69, and the ambulance came and saw that she was an African-American lady and wouldn't take her to the hospital, and just left her there to bleed to death, and they picked her up and took her to the Riverside Hotel, which was a black hotel, and that's where she died. And I got this out of the room where she laid at and died, and this is when you, and they still rent rooms there, believe it or not, and when you go in, when you sign in, this is what you fill out. This is from the Riverside Hotel in Clarksdale, Mississippi. This last piece here is a magazine, Living Blues magazine, which is published every couple of months, and it'll tell you exactly what's going on in the blues. And you'll see that most of the blues guys was born within 50 miles of each other here. This is a map of the Mississippi, and some of the folks that came out of there, like James Cotton, Big Walter Horton, Big Daddy, Booker T, Washington White, Bukka White, all these folks was really born really close to each other in the Mississippi Delta. So that's the blues from Africa to pre-World War II. I hope it's been entertaining. I know you're going to hear a lot of good music, talk about a lot of good music today and this evening. I'm just glad that Bob was able to schedule Roots at the beginning, Blues Roots at the beginning of the presentation, because quite frankly, everything you're going to hear today came from here. Thank you very much.
Once again, everybody, thank you, Mr. Bradley Alston, dropping some serious knowledge on us about a topic that we all need to know some more about, and that's the blues. So thank you very much, Bradley. And
This is Don Covay, and you listen to SoulPatrol.net radio. Hello.